Hey everyone, welcome back to FPL Fran. Today's video is going to be my Game Week 3 preview. We've just watched the Arsenal versus Crystal Palace match when Arsenal were playing 10 versus 11. Now we move on to the three leading questions for Game Week 3. The first question, of course, is what to do with your forwards. For people who own João Pedro, do you move away from him, someone who just blanked and also came off the bench? Do you also think about options like Wisa, Jackson, and Alvarez? What to do if you're owning Watkins as well? In the midfield, what to do with your Arsenal midfielders, your United midfielders, or even if you own Madison, who seems like he's a bit of an injury doubt. Question number 3 is about the defenders as well. What to do with the recently benched Gabriel for the second game in a row if you have James or Stones who were just recently injured and will be out for Game Week 3 for the time being at least. So going back to question 1, I think the forwards is quite interesting. If you own João Pedro, what I would say is you don't really need to actually think about selling him. You need to actually wait for the news about Enciso because Enciso actually took a bit of a knock in Game Week 2. So it actually depends on whether Enciso is out. And in my opinion, the simplest transfer if you have money in the bank is to go from João Pedro to Jackson. But if you don't have the opportunity to do that, I would also consider Alvarez a lot. In fact, Alvarez is quite interesting because they just brought in Doku, who I think is just confirmed by Fabrizio. But at this point, you know that there aren't too many people competing for positions. And actually, Game Week 3 is all about punting versus that great fixture. Jackson has Luton Town, and someone like Alvarez has Sheffield United. I don't think Doku's going to really get himself into the team by Game Week 3. So the idea here is, do you keep on with this punt here and go for another player who has slightly doubtful minutes in terms of Alvarez, given City's lack of bench right now based on the KDB injury, and also, of course, just simply if you just look at the previous match versus Newcastle, Pep, once again, no subs, just showing the strength of someone like Alvarez right now, given that Bernardo Silva is dealing with an injury too. So I think this is the landscape of FPL where I would actually think about holding João Pedro, waiting for the conference news, because he's at 5.6 million now. Even if he price drops back to 5.5, you're not going to lose any transfer value. Doesn't seem like any of the other forwards are actually going up in price outside of Isak, and you don't really want Isak anyways, in my opinion. I would still go for someone like Jackson or someone like Alvarez, and I would actually wait for the news in terms of whether we get confirmation that Enciso is out, and then actually make that move away from João Pedro. If you do have the money back, as I said, it's very simple to go for Jackson. Yes, there are rumors that Chelsea are going into the transfer market once again for a forward, but I don't really think that actually means another striker, because we need to sort of watch what Pochettino says. He didn't really mention that there was a striker issue in the post-match press conference. As far as moving forwards towards the second question, which is the midfields, Madison actually seems to be still dealing with an assessment of his injury, so the most important thing here, if you've already moved from Madison, is to actually wait for the injury assessment. It seems like he might actually miss Game Weeks 3 and 4, maybe 3 at the minimum, but that's, of course, quite crucial because Game Week 3 is a good match. Tottenham, of course, are probably a team that we want to target for Game Weeks 4 and 5, given that we already own some Arsenal and United midfielders who have really good Game Weeks 3. I would say if you're owning Bruno Fernandes, Rashford, or even someone like Martinelli, or even Havertz, for example, I would still consider keeping these picks, even though they've blanked practically all this time, even though Martinelli actually got a very jammy assist in the previous week. So in this situation, I would say just see out the great fixture in Game Week 3, get a little bit more information, and if you really want to actually make an aggressive move, I think there are 2 transfer picks. I can understand wanting to move away because you're frustrated with the blanks, but ultimately FPL is about also somewhat waiting for your assets to do good, because as you know, someone can blow up at any time, and someone like Mbumo can get 16 points in one game week, and that sort of rectifies holding an asset for 1 to 2 weeks, and that's simply the landscape of FPL. I would say the home fixtures are so good for United and Arsenal, I would keep, but as I said, if you really want to move away and you're very stressed about it, you're, let's say, someone who owns Havertz and doesn't want to deal with a price drop, then go towards someone like a Foden or a Sterling. I think Foden is actually one of the players who right now, based on the KDB injury, is most secure from a minutes perspective, just due to the fact that he can play on the left wing, which we've seen before, even though Grealish occupies that position mostly. The fact that he can also play in those sort of midfield advanced positions and also even the right wing position at times, particularly now that Bernardo Silva is out. So I do think that that's why Foden is such an exhilarating pick at this point in time. Even though Doku will probably come in and take this right wing spot, it's very likely that Foden will continue to play within the midfield. So I would say Foden is a very good punt. And of course, Sheffield United away, a chance to actually take Foden on this sort of fixture is very beneficial. So I'm okay with Foden there. As far as Sterling, once again, he's not been actually super close in terms of goal scoring opportunities. He's more been a creator. And I think his best match as of late at least under Pochettino, even including the preseason games, was going to be that West Ham game where they lost 3-1. Now, what I would say about Sterling is because of the plethora of injuries that Chelsea have, the biggest thing that's going in his favor is he's going to have likely another 85 to 90 minutes versus Luton Town, which is huge. At this stage, when you're looking at the great fixtures that Chelsea have, basically 3 games in a row where they have really good fixtures, and you're looking at the midfield landscape, and a lot of people are blanking left and right. You have someone like Foden, who still is a little bit of a doubt because, of course, there are some new transfers coming into the City team. I do think Sterling is someone who actually has really good minutes going forwards just because of the injuries and just really good fixtures. So even though you might not particularly rate Sterling, I do think he's actually quite a big pick. And also with Richarlison, another question people would probably be asking is, given the early substitution versus United, is he worth keeping? And I would also say the same thing here. Because of the sort of lack of depth within the Spurs team, Richarlison is not really going to be someone who starts from the bench, in my opinion. I find it hard to see Son, for example, starting at the center forward position, and then Perisic, for example, starting at left wing. So I do think we'll continue to see Richarlison starting, which also means that you should try and hold Richarlison over these fixtures if you've gone early for Richarlison. And the same logic is sort of the case with Maddison. If he actually seems to be fit, which I think is rather unlikely given the reports and given the fact that at this stage we still don't know exactly what the scans will reveal for his injury status, Maddison is probably someone you have to unfortunately move out of, and I would at this point then consider a Foden or a Sterling. Personally, I would actually go for Foden. I just think he's a much more explosive pick, better goal scorer as well, because I think Raheem is a poor finisher, and that's just someone who I would back in this instance here, given that Raheem is someone who we know has a great history of actually scoring goals in the Premier League. But in reality, the XG has been really poor outside of Man City, and I'm not exactly seeing the signs, for example, for this Chelsea attack to be that explosive. So that's sort of my main concern, given the injuries that they have and Nkunku still being out. So that's how I would navigate the midfield landscape. As far as the defenders this week, I actually think that oddly, because of the Tomiyasu red card, Arsenal don't really have a choice, and Zinchenko will play next week. So Gabriel is probably going to get the start versus Fulham. I know this is super frustrating for owners, and maybe the simplest thing is once again just doing Gabriel to Saliba, but in reality, I do think Gabriel will start the next week. I did say, of course, in the previous week that I think Gabriel would start again, simply because I thought Zinchenko was actually fit and ready to go. It actually seems like Tomiyasu was the one who played, but Zinchenko came on as a substitute, and now you at least have Gabriel most likely going to be a starter for Game Week 3. I can understand, once again, reacting to price rises and drops. It's very hard to actually keep Gabriel, but this seems to be the most sensible play, unfortunately, keeping Gabriel here. If you want to move away, I do think Chilwell is clearly the better pick because Chilwell has a simply better fixture than Gabriel, much more attacking potential. You can already see he's playing left wing minutes, of course, with the doubt that sometimes he can get taken off early like he did in the West Ham game, which is a little bit odd if we're being quite honest. Alternatively, you can just go for someone who's quite safe and sort of replaces the role of Gabriel, but for a better defensive team, which would be for Arsenal. So Ruben Dias is always going to be my suggested pick in these instances because Gabriel is someone who, you sort of see as someone who can get set piece action, but nothing else more than that. Maybe bonus points in a game like in the Crystal Palace game where Saliba got 2 bonus points, but Ruben Dias should be the most nailed City player, and I would go for Ruben Dias in this instance. You can also look towards an Akanji or a Walker if you actually want to save a bit of money. I think because of the Stones injury, it's probably the case that we'll continue to see Walker and Akanji continue to play. Akanji is someone who can slide into multiple positions in this team. They are pretty much playing a back four at this point in time, with Stones being out and not really trying to replicate the Stones role within the team. We did see that in the Super Cup, but it didn't look particularly pretty with Akanji sort of replicating that role. And Rico Lewis being benched versus Newcastle was a glimpse of what we can see when Rico Lewis is actually benched too. So I do think Akanji right now is more nailed. Walker feels like someone who is a little bit of a short-term play because Stones, of course, has an injury, and that probably allows for Walker to continue playing. Whereas between Ake and Guardiola, I do think there's a lot of competition there, and we don't really see the same positional flexibility. So that's kind of my concern, I would say. As far as some budget defenders, if you don't actually have any extra budget to play with, or you really want to, let's say, extend your budget so you can actually go for a much more aggressive midfield or forward transfer, I definitely would think about Udogie as one of my 4.5 defenders. He covers really well in terms of game weeks 4 and 5, particularly for Spurs. So long term, when you actually see yourself trying to play a back three, I do think he covers some great gaps. We know that United and Arsenal is a great game when you need coverage for the defenders, because I don't really see myself playing either defenders from each teams if I can avoid it. So when you can play a Stupinian instead, and when you can actually go for someone else like a Udogie, I'd probably actually do that in game week 4. On top of that, when I look at some of the budget picks, I do think Gusto is a very simple pick, but he's a much more short-term pick because we know Reece James is out for a few weeks. Out for a few weeks can mean that he can actually come back by, let's say, game week 5. So my concern here is, of course, what are you going to do with this Gusto position? If this Gusto position is someone where you're actually expecting, consistent starts, don't blow your transfer on someone like Gusto. But if you, let's say, only have 4 or 5 defenders and you're looking to actually move into a defender who can cover some gaps, such as game weeks 3 and 4, then I would move for Gusto, because Gusto makes a lot of sense covering these great Chelsea fixtures for game weeks 3 and 4. Other than that, I wouldn't really see him as a permanent start of my team. I think that's way too much budget sort of being cut from the defense, whereas you do really want a solid defensive backline. I myself have, for example, 3 to 4 starting defenders, and then I still have Gusto in my team as well. So that's sort of how I'm positioning my team, and I do think people should look at it very similarly, because you can see every week it is beneficial to have good defenders with good starting fixtures. That's why, for example, City defense is so useful when you have someone like Diaz who's nailed and he doesn't have a concussion in game week 1, or when you have someone like Saliba who's able to sort of see out all these fixtures, with Arsenal right now being the most nailed player within this defense. So this is sort of how I would see the defensive landscape. This is the game week 3 preview. I hope you guys have a wonderful week ahead, and let me know if you have any other questions in terms of pressing questions and so on and so forth. Thank you guys so much, and I'll see you guys in the next video.